In 2047, a colony of scientists, farmers, soldiers, priests, artists, and AI, all looking for a new life, landed on Mars. The mission was simple: to survive and establish a...
What happened?
To survive and establish...
We are so far beyond keeping it together.
To survive and establish...
Then you can come at me right now!
To survive. Marsfall, survival on the Red Planet. Marsfall is a science fiction podcast about the first colonists on Mars. Listen for free wherever you find your favorite podcasts.
Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast. I'm Bill Kelly. Well, next week we'll see Hamilton start to open back up, but what exactly can Hamiltonians do once that happens? And it's starting to look a lot like Premier Doug Ford is moving less of a leadership role and more into campaign mindset. Ontario is still under restrictions. Is that a wise political move? And we hear more and more about Canada's history with residential school systems. It's truly heartbreaking, but thoughts and prayers only go so far. What needs to be done? It's all coming up, the Bill Kelly Podcast, and it starts now.
Today on the Bill Kelly Show on 900 CHML.
As we know, there's been a great deal of concern about the economy and the impact that the pandemic has had. Other parts of the country have moved a lot faster than we have in implementing the reopening and opening the doors for more and more people. I'm going to be generous here and say being cautious in Ontario. Anyway, Phase 2 starts a couple of days earlier than the scheduled start that the Premier talked about a couple of weeks ago. So what is entailed with that? What can we do? What can't we do? What can we anticipate? Joining us to talk about this is Paul Johnson. Paul, of course, is the Director of the Emergency Center for the City of Hamilton during this pandemic. He's a busy guy. Paul, really appreciate you taking some time for us today. Thanks.
It's great to be with you, Bill.
Let me ask you right off the bat, because I know that just about everything that we talk about here and about what's opening, what's not, and you know, the way that we're going to do this is very much tied to the number of cases in the vaccine program. If you could, maybe let's start off there and talk about what's happening here in this area with the hospitalizations, ICU. I know that when we talked to Dr. Richardson earlier this week, she seemed quite pleased about the fact that those numbers are down considerably. Now, I say that with the qualifier that, of course, this Delta variant is out there someplace. Is it having an impact? Do you see any spikes, or are we still holding our own, I guess?
It's certainly a concern, the Delta variant, and the spike that everybody's watching with great interest because it shows how fast things can change is in the Waterloo region area.
Yeah.
So there's a region that's decided they are not moving it to Step 2 next week with the rest of the province, and it's solely driven by the fact that they have an increased number of cases and in certain areas have some outbreaks that they want to get control of. So it is a reminder that we are, we're not out of this. This isn't that we've reached the end and now it's just how come we can't do this and how come we can't do this. It is about trying to balance reopening, getting back to doing some activities, but recognizing just how fast things can change. Locally, we're in good shape. I mean, the variant is there. Dr. Richardson is concerned about it all the time. But if you look provincially, I was informed by Rob McIsaac from Hamilton Health Sciences, below 300 in terms of hospitalized COVID-19 patients across the province for the first time in a long time. So those are good indicators locally, good capacity from a hospital perspective. Our vaccine rates, creeping up towards that 75% range for first dose and creeping towards 25% for fully vaccinated with 2 doses in Hamilton. So it's a tremendous reminder of how well people are doing getting that vaccine. We need to keep that rolling, but it puts us in a position where, I think the steps that are being taken to allow more activities, particularly in an outdoor setting, are a high time, and it's the right time, and let's go do it.
Interesting point about KW, if I could just go back there for a second. They've said, no, we're not ready for this. Now, I know when you and I have talked in the past, you are pretty much tied to the provincial guidelines. In other words, you can't say to the ministry, well, no, we're in pretty good shape. We're going to go to phase 3. You have to follow those guidelines. But from what you're telling me, you can opt not to go forward if you think that there's a concern in your community.
Absolutely, and that's the role of medical officers of health, and it would be no different here in Hamilton if Dr. Richardson felt that there was a reason that we shouldn't move forward. And you saw it in the Porcupine Health District as we moved into Step 1. There was some outbreaks up north, and you've seen it happen from time to time. You've seen medical officers of health work with their school boards when schools were open to say, no, you're out for another week. We're going to take a break. Those types of things. So those are the good local measures that can happen. And in the case of Waterloo. They clearly felt that they wanted a little more time to get control of those cases and make sure that they were doing everything they could to get those case counts down and not exasperated by having more and more activities occur. But in our area, we're being cautious. We're hopeful that we don't see any large upticks in the number of cases for whatever reason in this community, and but happy to see some of this stuff moving forward in terms of the reopening.
Are you happy with the way the vaccine program is rolling out? The uptake on that?
Very happy with the way it's rolling out, and to date, very happy with how our numbers have looked. There's a few things happening now. It is starting to slow down, and so you're into that last period of time where now you're trying to really get to people who have not stepped forward for any amount of vaccine, whether it's the first dose, let alone getting the second dose. And so that's a concern because we're starting to run into some of that slowdown. And now it really is about making sure we've got enough appointments, getting that supply in and getting everybody that second dose so they can be fully vaccinated. But, the numbers are very strong. The way we've run this program has been very good. And now it's going to be the really heavy lifting of working with parts of our community and whether it's geographically based or whether it's population based, and really trying to do that ongoing encouragement of vaccine readiness so that people can get that first dose, they can get that second dose and be fully covered.
The reticence that some people have, we'll get into that in just a second, is one thing, but is there also a concern here that there are some people in the community that maybe don't understand or you haven't reached out to let them know how they can do this? Is there a better way of communicating with them?
We're always looking for those better ways, and so public health is working with community organizations. So we have ambassadors now out in the field. We have organizations that have taken on the operation of some of these vaccine clinics in order to help make sure that we can get people in. The Droit de Desnay, for instance, the original community health center, working very much in a clinic setting, and the Restoration House clinic being turned over to community organizations to run everything and really work hard at getting people into those clinics. We're really thrilled that ArcelorMittal Dofasco stepped up and they are fully running another clinic which allows access geographically to more people in this community. So those are the things that we continue to do, continue to talk about it from a communication perspective. But this is the hard work that will dominate our activities over the coming months, is to now get to those that for a variety of reasons have not chosen to step forward and have a vaccine so far.
Early days of the vaccine, Paul, going back into the early months of this year, I guess, when we started to get things rolling here. You'd mentioned at the time that one of the strategies that you wanted to employ was to reach out to leaders in some of these communities within the greater Hamilton area and have them as advocates for that. Is that working?
It is to some degree, but it's slow and steady work. I mean, I've been doing community development for a long time. It's the right model. It's a good model. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be successful with the flick of a switch. And so, yes, continue to work with leaders in racialized communities and our Indigenous communities, and at a local level from a geographical perspective, partnering with organizations that can get the message out. Your neighbors, your community associations, whatever it is, talking to you is sometimes a better thing than listening to the media or listening to public health or civic officials. So whatever it takes, we're going to do and look at ways that we can tailor campaigns over the summer to make sure that people continue to understand the importance of receiving that vaccine. And then if there are access issues that we need to solve coming out of those conversations, locations, times, the mode of how we're delivering the vaccine, we can adjust our piece to that. But we feel we have that in check. We've got good, large mass vac sites that are very efficient and effective, and lots of people moving through those. And then we have smaller, whether they're ongoing clinics or pop-up clinics, that offer people a little bit of a different approach for those that don't feel comfortable coming to a large center, say like the First Ontario Centre, to get their vaccine. Many have been pleased to be able to go to some of these smaller sites. So I think logistically we're set up. I think it's going to be more work at a community level, more work with leaders in this community to encourage people to take that step.
When you're doing the counting on this here, do you track exactly which location is getting most of the reaction to this? You mentioned the First Ontario Centre downtown, the Braley Centre. I mean, there's a number of different places, and that makes sense. I mean, downtown is where there's the heaviest concentration of people that are living there. And I hear an awful lot of people going to the St. Joe's campus on West 5th for that as well. But do you track and find out if you're reaching those groups that really need to be reached in situations like this? Because I'm hearing anecdotally from a lot of people that are using those downtown facilities that say they're busy most of the time.
Yeah, our mass vaccination sites, the two downtown, Hamilton Health Sciences, First Ontario Centre, and then the one on the mountain at West 5th through St. Joe's, they are consistently busy, and that's where the majority of people are signing up. Okay. Lots of places available, and then we track for the other ones that we have, and we have dozens of other pop-up clinics or mobile clinics and things. We do look at whether they're meeting the needs, but sometimes it is about making sure that we are accessible. So even if the numbers aren't huge, we do need to be places where people are, and whether those are in the rural parts of Hamilton or whether those are in specific neighborhoods, we're going to continue to be there. And what it does offer is, it won't be as busy. It's not going to be the same setup as a mass vaccination clinic. But for those that are a little bit nervous, for those who want to be in a smaller, more intimate environment for it, that works really well. So if that means we're only doing 50 to 100 doses a day, that's perfectly fine, because for those folks, they might not have gone to a larger facility. So that's the rationale for the way the logistics are rolling out. We're always trying to tweak it based on the feedback we receive from the community.
All right, let's step into what we're going to be doing. And by the way, when I say we're going to move into phase 2, I just want to remind our listeners, not today. It's going to be June 30th, okay? So it's still, the usual stuff going on for at least another week here, too. Somebody asked me yesterday when they made the announcement, they said, phase 2, that's just like what we had back when. I said, it's all a blur to me. I forget. But it was sometime earlier this year where we had this sort of thing. The number of gatherings outside and indoors is going to increase, not significantly, but marginally. And there are a few other things that are going on here, too, vis-a-vis dining and what they call non-essential businesses.
Yeah, so, this move to step 2 is really about expanding outdoor options for folks with some notable indoor things happening, which I'll get to in a second. So it's really more about outdoor. So for those expecting, large amounts of indoor spaces to open, that's not happening quite yet. But it is an expansion of those outdoor activities and getting back to some of the and increasing some of the capacity for particularly the non-essential retail. So the big change, though, from an indoor capacity is on the social gathering side. Now it is permitted to have up to 5 people gather indoors from a social gathering perspective. So that's a change up until this point. And as of today, it's prohibited. So starting next Wednesday, you can have 5 people indoors, up to 5 people. The other piece is that those personal services, the haircuts and the hair salons, the barbershops, they are allowed to open as of June 30th as well, provided that masks can be worn at all times within the facilities, and there's appointment-only based services there. So that's an indoor activity that's new to, we haven't had that for quite some time, as some of us with a bit of a shaggy look can attest to. The other pieces that'll happen is increased capacities within non-essential businesses and essential businesses. So more people are allowed in at one time, but those businesses, of course, have been open since step 1. From an outdoor capacity, more people on patios, 6 people to a table on the patio front. But the other good news is now there is limits being set for things like outdoor concerts and festivals and events. So it can be up to 25% of the outdoor capacity of the venue, which means, Bill, we can be back to having live music outdoors and having some of those outdoor concerts or even outdoor festivals at a 25% capacity. So that's a big shift, and that lets us know that we're getting back to some of those activities that we all look forward to in the summer.
Small point, but I mean, I was at a patio. Rebecca and I were there just the other day, one of our favorite places downtown. And somebody asked, can you have music? Because they usually did. And they said, no, we're not allowed to. But they will be allowed to. In other words, if they want to have somebody playing guitar or something at the outside patio, not indoors, but outside.
Outdoors on the patio, they can have music. The only restriction is that the musicians need to be at least 3 meters away from any patron, or there needs to be a physical barrier. So as long as you've got the right spacing in place, you can see outdoor patio with some music or concerts, and then obviously some of the larger outdoor venues, and not only in Hamilton but in other places that are surrounding us. There's some great venues that offer some awesome outdoor opportunities for music and entertainment, and those will be able to go at a reduced capacity. And so I understand 25% is well down the capacity list, but it's something, Bill, we start getting back towards more of those normal activities.
In a situation like this, I know the Premier had made a vow that he figured by the end of the summer, I guess by Labor Day weekend, everybody in Ontario would be double vaxxed. Anybody that wanted the vaccines is going to get one. I know that's a political promise, and I'm not going to ask you to make a commitment like that too. But are you confident that this program is going to continue here in this area, that we're going to see those numbers, and even if we don't get there, but be close to that by the end of the summer?
Well, we're tracking well on that, and certainly from available to the public, I believe that's very doable. The supply is very solid. I know people are fixated on what the brand name is, but we just look at it as vaccine. The vaccine coming in is going to be plentiful enough, whether it's Moderna or Pfizer, into this community, that we're going to be able to offer those opportunities. So we need people to step up. We need people to take those opportunities. We need people to step forward and do it. But I think from can we be there? The answer is I think so. As opposed to earlier on in this program where the supplies were so constrained that this was going to take a long period of time. What's changed? Supply. And that's a good news story for us because we have the capacity to vaccinate a lot of people on a daily basis in this community. We've always been ready to do that, and we are today.
And we just wanted to remind, we're just about finished up here, I'm out of time, but for the listeners who are still being concerned about this and a little hesitancy, I've had so many doctors on the last couple of days, Paul, and I just want to remind them, Pfizer and Moderna, they're virtually the same thing. There's no reason to be vaccine shopping. As one doctor told me, it's like Coke and Pepsi. You want cola? It's the same stuff. It's just a different brand name. That's really what it comes down to.
It is, and people need to recognize, too, when you do those things, you also block, if you walk away from your appointment because you say, hey, I'd rather get another brand name, well, somebody else didn't get that appointment because you had it. And so you're actually harming other people who want to step up, want to get the second dose or their first dose as soon as possible. So I really encourage people, to listen to those medical professionals who are saying exactly what you just said. These are mRNA vaccines, and they are very effective, both of them, and you should roll up your sleeve for either one of them. And then the second piece is walking away not only doesn't help you because you're not getting the vaccine, it also has an impact in terms of how we get other people in who want to get that vaccine.
Exactly. Well, we're trending in a positive way, and that's good news, I suppose. Paul, thanks as always. Great having you on the program today. Have a great weekend.
You too, Bill. Thank you.
You're listening to the Bill Kelly Show podcast on 900 CHML.
More than a few observers around the Queen's Park and provincial government have noticed and opined that it seems that Premier Doug Ford seems to be moving into campaign mode as opposed to governing mode. And there is a difference exactly how that goes. And, is that really the smart thing to be doing? Because we're not out of the woods yet when it comes to the pandemic, and there's still an awful lot of work to be done on this. Joining us to talk about this is Richard Brennan, former journalist for the Toronto Star who covered Queen's Park and Parliament Hill for many, many years. Badger, good to have you with us again. Hope you're doing well.
Hey, Bill.
You're double vaxxed, aren't you?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Oh, you can stay on the show then. All right.
Anyway. By the way, before we start, I'm just on my way back from Ottawa, where the place is abuzz with talk of election.
I'm not surprised by that. I mean, didn't we see that? Let me just go down that road for a little bit, and then we'll get into our provincial stuff here. As much as it seemed to be an indicator, the kind of rhetoric that was going back and forth between the leaders earlier this week seems to indicate that these guys, we talk about the Premier being in election mode, those three party leaders are all in election. Well, I can probably throw the bloc in there as well.
Oh, definitely. They've adjourned for the summer, and they won't be coming back. There's going to be an election. I'm almost positive of that. Yeah, it's just that the Liberals are high in the polls right now, and the Conservatives are low in the polls. So I guess they're going to strike when the iron's hot.
Well, depending on, and you've seen this play out before, depending on which poll you're leading, the Liberals have a 10-point lead to a 4 or 5-point lead, something like that. I don't see them in majority territory yet, but it's still, there's a comfort level there that I guess they're going to try to grab onto.
Oh, I think I'm not guaranteeing there's going to be a majority. but they're going to go for it. They're hoping, they'll hope like mad that they get one, but I don't think it's a sure thing yet.
Well, when do you expect it? I mean, you talked to a lot of your colleagues up there over the last little while. Are they anticipating sooner than later? I mean, before?
Yeah, well, they're probably. I think they're talking about maybe a September election. Get through the summer. And
so he'd probably call it in August then.
Yeah. They'll, and it won't be a long election. Maybe 35 days or 30 days. I guess it's 35 days. And, it won't be one of those gigantic elections that won't seem to go on forever.
Well, that seems to be the buzz around town, and we'll see if it actually happens. There's a lot to go on between now and then. We know there's going to be an election here in Ontario. That's going to be next year, about a year from now, next June. We will go to the polls once again, and obviously Doug Ford would like to be reelected. And by the way, I want to preface what we're saying here about how the Premier seems to be moving into election mode. So is Andrea Horwath, and so is Stephen Del Duca. I mean, but they're not running the province right now. But I mean, I get that. The 12 months before this, you should be leaning towards the next election and developing strategies and things of this nature. But that's one of the problems of governing, isn't it? Is that you have to do that, but at the same time, you have a job to do.
Well, yeah, but the wheels of government still grind away regardless of what these folks are up to. I mean, he's on a mission to reshape and remake himself as a kindly, lovable premier who's just one of the guys, and you're going to be seeing that kind of tale throughout, the next year or before the election. I mean, he's desperately trying to tell people that the pandemic's behind us, and we're the government that you need to go into, for the economy to improve, to go into the future, and that will be the kind of mantra that you'll hear for weeks now.
But that raises the question then, if he's of the belief that the worst of the pandemic is behind us, then why are we going so slowly with the reopening plan? So that's the damned if you do, damned if you don't situation.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're headed that way. It's a slow grind, but we're headed that way. And by the time the next election rolls around, things should be pretty open. It may not be wide open, and we may be still wearing masks. God knows then, but certainly the worst will be behind us, and that's the message he's going to be delivering.
What kind of a strategy would they be talking about? We mentioned that Corey Tenaykin, of course, who managed the last election, is back, and a lot of the other advisors that were part of the Ford campaign in the last provincial election are back in there, and obviously they're the ones who are going to be advising him these days. Part of the strategy from the last election, as you and I talked about back then, was basically, it seems kind of like a reverse thing that you would expect, but they kind of pulled Doug Ford back, and not as many public appearances, not as many Q&As with media, very, very structured and very controlled as to the message that got out there. Yesterday was a classic example. I mean, Dr. David Williams giving his last press conference as medical officer of health, handing the reins over. Ordinarily, I'm sure the Premier would have been there, as he has been with these daily press conferences, but he was nowhere to be seen there. I figured, let these guys do this. I'm just going to stay in the background and strategically make appearances now, as opposed to every day and everywhere.
Well, the old peekaboo campaign where he makes himself available periodically, but not all the time, and so he doesn't mess up. He doesn't say something silly that will garner headlines in the paper. It's an old strategy. Let's face it. But whether it will work or not, I mean, this is always a question. Are people going to see that for what it is, or will they just say, fine, we don't want to see him that much anyway? We saw him for several months every day, so maybe we don't need to hear from him or see him for the next little while.
Well, it worked that way. I mean, that was Stephen Harper's strategy. It's probably not coincidental that Corey Tank was part of those campaigns. But it was, as you say, it was strategic hit. Here's the thing. A lot of the time he wouldn't take questions, and if he did, it was maybe 1-2 questions, that was it. And Ford seemed to employ that the last time around, and he won. So it's not surprising that they would try to do something like that again, because let's face it, when you're the incumbent, I don't care if you're Doug Ford or any other incumbent premier or prime minister, you've got a track record, and there's a lot of things that people would like to ask Doug Ford about. Incursions into the Greenbelt, Highway 413, the pandemic protocol, the rollout. There's a lot of stuff going on here, and if you're not in front of the microphones, you don't have to answer those questions.
And that's it. You're right. Tonight worked, with Harper, and it'll be a controlled. I mean, maybe not so much now until we get right into the campaign, but
Sure.
You can believe when we finally do get in the campaign, it will be tightly controlled. Because they don't want, he's not good on his feet. And they don't know, and God bless him, they don't know what he's going to say next. So you can I can tell you right now, it's going to be tightly controlled, so he doesn't mess up.
And by the way, that's not a direct criticism of Doug Ford. It's a reality. And he's not the only politician. Some of them just aren't very good in front of the microphone. Some of them just aren't very good at ad-libbing and delivering the message like that. It's not his strength. And in an election campaign, one slip can really cause a lot of problems.
Well, we've seen that time and time again where, somebody, Tim Hudak saying that it's going to get rid of 100,000 jobs a few years ago. Mm-hmm. Well, that was the end. The election was done right then.
John Tory, full funding for all religious schools.
Funding, yeah, and it's been one example after the other over many years, where a slip up can cost you an election, and that's what they do not want. They don't want any slip ups, and so what he's going to be for this summer he'll be doing the barbecue swing and chatting with people and going to towns and. Just walking around and making himself available, just, with regular folks. But whether he makes himself available to the media will be another question. And I suggest that won't happen very much. Even beginning now, I think the lid's going to be down somewhat.
Is part of the strategy in a situation like this, if you're going to do these things, the barbecue circuit, as they call it, make sure it's a friendly place? In other words, I just saw something on Facebook yesterday about it's a fundraiser. I think it's a virtual fundraiser with the Premier and Rod Phillips, who he brought back into cabinet, and it's $1,600 to enter. It's something. It's a fundraiser for the party, obviously. We know that. But is that the sort of thing you do? I mean, he's going to go to barbecues where it's a conservative crowd that he in other words, he's preaching to the faithful.
Yeah, you're not going to see him downtown Toronto. Yeah, in Toronto Centre or someplace like that. He's not going to make an appearance there. He's going to go where he has strength, and that's they all do that. They're going to go where the people are friendly towards him and the party. They certainly aren't going to venture into enemy territory by any stretch.
At what point?
You see before you go. You see the other leaders too, where, like you mentioned previously, that they're starting to gear up. There's Andrew Horvath has ads on TV now. I wish she'd asked me before, because I think her ad is terrible, but that's another thing.
At what point?
All signs are pointing to it, that's for sure.
Yeah. At what point do you actually, throw caution to the wind and say, okay, we're in full campaign? I know they're going to drop the writ, and that's all part of the process. But the provincial legislature's on summer break right now too, and there's already, I think, there's a date when they are to return. I think it's sometime in late September, if I can recall. But that still leaves them about 5 or 6 months of time before the election actually holds. But on the other hand, I can remember Mike Harris at one point didn't call the House back after the summer recess at all, and they just sat there and did nothing, and then all of a sudden he called an election. Now, Ford has that as an option, by the way. When we say the next election is June, I believe the legislation indicates that he can call it sooner if he wants.
Absolutely, he can call it sooner. Whether he does or not, it'll all depend on the polls. Just like federally, they'll
Sure.
look at the polls and say, "Boy, this is the time to go." Whether he does that, no, I'm not so sure. You're really, I mean, look what happened to David Peterson when he called an election many years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Called an early election, and it was his downfall, or a major contributor anyway. So you take a chance by doing that. Now, I really don't think that's going to happen. But why would you call an election when you can skip and scotch across the province, and the taxpayers are paying for it? Once you call an election, the parties have to pay for it. But now they can do the barbecue circuit, and you and I are paying for it.
Yeah, there's a classic story about David Peterson. He was, of course, the Liberal premier for the first time in a long time, and called the election. He still had a majority government. There's a long way away before the next election, and he called it figuring, there's going to be an economic downturn. I want to get another majority government so I can ride this out. And Lincoln Alexander told the story. Actually, it was David Peterson that told it at the memorial service when Link passed away. That he went to the lieutenant governor, who at that time was Lincoln Alexander, and said he wanted him to dissolve the legislature for an election. And he said the first thing Link did, he looked at him, he says, have you thought this thing through? Understanding the ramifications of this? And obviously he didn't, because he got his butt kicked, I guess, in the election. That was when Bob Rae got elected as premier. So you're right, it can backfire.
No, Link was absolutely right. There's no way he should have done that, and he lived to regret it. That was it. That was one of the major, like I say, factors in that election.
So probably fixed election date. So I think we're probably still going to go until June. And the strategy I would think here, as you say, is maybe kind of play it low key and just go to, and any public appearances are going to be in front of the party faithful, and that's where you're going to get your sound bites. But after that, I guess the part B of this is hope and keep your fingers crossed that this pandemic starts to go away and that we start opening up again. I mean, people are going to be in a much better mood next spring into the summertime when we go to the polls here in Ontario. If restaurants are open, if they can attend ball games, maybe even if the Blue Jays played on this side of the border, things like of that nature, that puts people in a much better mode of thinking, and that's the sort of thing that the government wants at this stage. This is not a very good time to be going to the polls, because there's a lot of people still ticked off that what they can't do and what they can't have right now.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, going to polls right now there's an unforeseen factor that they don't know what's going to happen. Is there a bubbling animosity out there that they don't see? I mean, they can do all the the polling and that they want, but if there's something that is unknown just below the surface that people are ticked off about, that's where you're taking a chance, and this could be a perfect example of that.
The other aspect of this, too, and it's an important part when we get into election mode, is performance in this. And we know that at the beginning of the pandemic, Premier Ford and the Prime Minister, as a matter of fact, just about all the premiers, had very high approval ratings for that first wave, the way they handled it. We weren't crazy about the lockdown, but we understood, okay, this has to happen, and we're going to try to, knock the virus down. We get that. But the more it was prolonged, and especially here in Ontario, with this latest lockdown that still has a lot of people angry right now. How long are voters' memories in a situation like that?
Short. Voters' memories are short, and that's what politicians count on. That they something that you and I might be talking about one day, and there's all hellfire going on because of it. 2 weeks from now, people won't remember, or they've got. You and I have talked about this before, Bill. People have lives, and they've got other things on their mind, and whatever nuance might happen at Queen's Park or in Ottawa doesn't really hold a lot of water for them until election time, and that's when probably the last week in election, when they turn their minds to the events of the day, what issues are meaningful to them. But until then, it's kind of white noise.
Well, I guess it just validates that old point about all politics is local. You know, how is this affecting my life? You know, in my neighborhood, with my family, with my kids going to school, my job, things of this nature. You know, can I go on vacation? If everything is good and you're figuring, hey, life isn't that bad, you're probably not angry at the government. You may not be ecstatic of who is governing at the time, but you're comfortable with it. And that's obviously the game that Ford's going to be shooting for here.
Of course it is. Summertime is a good time just to kind of float through the province. Not do anything spectacular, but, you know, meet some people here and there, and not be in their face. Nobody wants a politician in their face during the summer. I mean, that's been a long tradition that you do not do that. Summer campaigns are not great campaigns because people their minds are on their holidays and vacation and traveling and staying at cottages. They're there. That's where their head's at. It's not hearing some politician drone on about whatever policy they may or may not do.
Does the federal government understand that? Because it looks like that's what we might be doing.
Well, I think theirs will be towards the end of the summer when a lot of things are starting to wrap up.
Yeah.
But, you know, just to talk about that from the bill, there's a pile of bills federally that are just going to fall off the table.
Oh, yeah.
A ton. I see Canadian Press carried a list just recently, and there was a lot of what I consider, at least, fairly important stuff going on. And the budget bill is one of them, but the Senate will pass that. I don't think that's going to be a problem. But there's other things that that should go on, and they're not, because once they drop the writ and say we're going to election, then everything just falls off the table.
Well, that's a story we'll talk about when they finally drop the writ, and as you say, that may be sooner than later. Badger, thanks so much for the time. Have a safe trip home, first of all, and have a good weekend. We'll talk again soon.
Okay, Bill, thank you.
You're listening to the Bill Kelly Show podcast on 900 CHML.
Shocking stories yesterday, of course, about the revelation, as they told us just about 24 hours ago, of course, about the 751 bodies that were found at Maryvale, and Kamloops, of course, just a couple of weeks before that. And it's thankfully, it has been a catalyst for a conversation about residential schools and the impact that they've had on the Indigenous peoples in this country for so many years. Joining us to talk about this is Verna George. Verna is the daughter of a survivor of Ontario's Mohawk Institute Residential School. She holds 2 degrees from Trent University, one in Economic Development, the other in Native Studies, a graduate of the University of Windsor, Faculty of Law as well. Verna, it's a pleasure to have you on the program. Thanks so much for spending some time with us today.
Good morning, Bill. Thank you.
I guess I'll ask you, Verna, the same question I asked rhetorically just before we went into the news break there. This latest information, is this going to make a difference? Is this going to be the catalyst for change that we've been looking for generations?
I hope so. I hope every time more children bodies are recovered, that it keeps the conversation going on exactly what happened to Indigenous people and what continues to happen to Indigenous people. So that's one thing that I strive to do, is to provide education in presentations, and to make sure that our young people, our young students know what actually happened in the past, because that actually gives me hope that they'll continue on and try and rectify all this damage that has been done.
Why was there, and is there to this day, so little information about residential schools? I know, I can go way back to my elementary school days. I was raised in the Catholic system, and we were told about missionaries that were going up to these, remote places to teach the little, Indians, as they called them back in those days, the language and to educate them. And we thought, well, that's a wonderful thing. That was the story, and we all bought into it.
Yes, that was their narrative. That was their way of ensuring that no more questions would be asked of, why are you doing this? any kind of yardstick on, is it working? Are you teaching these children what you want to teach them? None of that. No accountability was done. And now, because we are recovering all these little Indigenous souls, that has to be done. That conversation has to be had now. People need to be held accountable for this time that we're going through. I mean, this is such a hard time. Every time that bodies are recovered, it is it's for me, and like my views are that it does kind of knock the wind out of you, because it is, when you stop and think about exactly what they were trying to do, and the only reason they were trying to do it is because they were Indians. That makes you take a step back and realize that, oh my gosh, like, my ancestors had a target on their back all this time. I still have a target on my back. I need to do something. I need to do better for my kids, that they don't have to live in a world that views them as less than.
There are, I guess, two groups, well, probably many more than that, but I mean, we grieve, of course, for the children that lost their lives, and I would love to see some sort of an inquiry as to exactly what happened and how many of these children died, and that's one thing, and we're shocked, of course, by the enormity of the numbers that we're seeing. But the other group, and you just touched on it a second ago, Verna, are the survivors, those that still have the scars of what they went through. They've lived that for many, many years right now, and had to live with that, and the grief and the memories. And we've talked to other people that have gone to residential schools, and how that has impacted their lives even to this day. And it's one of those things where we haven't paid much attention to that. We don't pay much attention to mental health issues in this country at all. We're starting to increase that, and that's wonderful news. But this is one aspect of it that really needs to be talked about, I think, is the impact that it had on Indigenous peoples and their families, and continues to this day.
You're right. That's correct. For me and my story, when these recoveries happened, I spoke to my mom and, talked about things, how she was feeling. And, it just, and a wave of sadness comes over her, because, she has to think about some of the kids that they told her that, went back home. Maybe they really didn't go back home. Maybe that's what happened to them, is that they're lying in an unmarked grave somewhere. So it is a conversation that has to be done. And I think, again, the survivors have been through so much, horrific stories of what they endured. So I think it's time for the next generation to pick that up and go with it and strive for a better life for, the following generations. Like, I hope that people don't get numb to these numbers coming up and popping up on the TV, and hearing the First Nation and the chiefs have to speak about, the members of their community being recovered. That's my hope. That, why I'm here today is to make sure that people understand, even from my perspective, my, lonely little perspective, that it matters. And if it matters for you being a decent human being, you'd want to know more on how and why and how we can all do better.
Well, they talked about truth and reconciliation, and of course, former Senator Sinclair chaired that committee and did some extensive work on this. And as we've always said, there can be no reconciliation without truth. This is exposing an uncomfortable truth in our history. And I can tell you, an awful lot of people that I've talked to and have contacted me over the last couple of weeks since the Kamloops revelation are having a lot of trouble with this, accepting this, and not that they're denying it, that it actually happened, because we don't look at ourselves as Canadians as people would allow for this to go on. And, then you start to hear the rationalizations. Well, people like MacDonald and Ryerson, they were just victims of the social mores of their time. And that's not a reason. That's not an excuse for this. You've got to understand the gravity of this, because even John A. MacDonald, in one speech, was quoted as simply saying the whole purpose of these schools was to eradicate the Indigenous culture. They want them to speak English. They want them to be Christians. In other words, it's colonialism, isn't it?
Yes.
We're better than you, and we're going to make you like us.
Yes. And for some of those kids, their entire life, they did that, right? When they were, if they found, they stated that a 3-year-old was found in Kamloops. Mm-hmm. And that poor child, in those 3 short years, was made to feel like they didn't matter, that they weren't good enough being born Indigenous, that they needed to change. And somewhere along the line, someone thought that wasn't good enough. I don't know the circumstances of how that child died, but I don't know what circumstances would be reason enough to kill a 3-year-old, and except in the government and the church's eyes, was that he or she was born Indigenous. And when you stop and think about that, it is a hard truth, and that's what people don't want to talk about, because it is hard. It's hard for us. Some of the things that I've read, even this morning, made me sad and made me tear up, because, oh my goodness, yes, those survivors had to go through so much, and because of their age now, they remember these things if they see them on TV, and she described her grandmother, and it was just horrible. And I can't imagine having to do that and try and protect, your grandmother from the news, because it's going to revert them back to that time, and that in those feelings, those scared, that fear and hurt.
Verna, did your mother talk to you about her experience when she was at Mohawk Institute?
She did. She was there for 7 years. So when she was 6 years old, she went. And she doesn't, she has stated that she didn't encounter any, sexual abuse. Of course, there was physical, there was beatings. If they didn't do what they were told, they got beat. So she told me that. She told me her chores. Since the Mohawk Institute right now is under renovation, you can't actually go inside. Mm-hmm. But the Woodland Cultural Center offers virtual tours, which I've taken with her, and I've taken with some of my non-Indigenous friends now. They want to learn more about this. And it's just, the stories that she's told me, it's good to see exactly what she was talking about, like where the boys and the girls ate, and where they, had their, where they had to work and sew and all that, all those things. She does talk about that. So I think that's a good thing too, that she talks about it and she gets it out. But it's not, that's just one story. That's just my story. There's, so many others that don't have that, that kind of narrative.
The government made some commitments over the last couple of days, which I'm sure you've heard about. First of all, offering some money for other excavations and investigations, I guess, of some of the other sites to see. And I was going to say see if there were more graves. I think it's pretty much agreed that there are in many of these other places where they're going to be exploring. It's going to cost an awful lot of money. It's going to take an awful lot of time to do that. That's one element of this. What else has to happen, though, Verna, for the families that were involved in this to bring closure to this?
I think it's going to vary from everybody, but I think my thoughts are that to achieve reconciliation, there has to be forgiveness, And in order to be able to forgive someone, they have to take accountability of what they've done. And that, to me, isn't just lip service, it's actual things put in place. It is funding. It is, following some of the calls to action, to 70, 71, all of those ones that want to have the records and know who these children were. Those concrete actions need to be done, or else it's just the same. We're just repeating all the time of listening to the promises that, the government tells us, and always waiting. And I think maybe now that hopefully we're done waiting for those actions to come.
The federal government is doing a number of things, as we said, with the money that's involved in this. The Prime Minister and others have been quite contrite about this and not understanding the gravity of it. I mean, we even go back with, Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole some months ago, I guess about a year ago now, actually defending the residential schools, which I'm going to put down to simply lack of information about what was going on. And I guess a lot of us probably fall into that category. But when we look at what has to happen going forward here, and you said, for there to be reconciliation, there has to be forgiveness. But for there to be forgiveness, and I'll go back to what I learned in Catholic school when I was a kid, you have to own up to your sins and say, I was wrong. That's part of the process. And to that point, the Catholic Church was involved in many of these facilities. The Pope has said nothing. He said it was a tragedy. Well, that's pretty obvious that it is. But many of people are saying, look, there should be an apology from the Catholic Church. Do you agree with that?
I think for some people they might need that. And yes, for them, yes. But it is ironic, isn't it, what they taught you and what they've chosen to do? And so, I can't, the Mohawk Institute was Anglican, so I don't, I don't know if I need that from the Catholic Church. It would be nice to see, but again, are those just words, or is there going to be something else put in place to ensure that people know that they are sorry, that they acknowledge what hand they've done in this?
And those are strong words that have to come out. I mean, there has to be some sort of an admission that one of the stated goals of these was basically to wipe out the indigenous culture, the indigenous language. They wanted this whole generation of children to speak English and be Christian, as opposed to embracing their own cultures and their own languages. And I'm sure, as your mother told you, and many of the victims have told us, they were punished if they spoke their own language, at least in the school environment anyway. And those, I don't care what the mindset was back then, we now know that it was wrong. And there has to be some admission of that, wouldn't you think?
Yes, I do. I do think that. And that's just the first step, right? It's the first step that they can take to say, yes, what we did was wrong. And now let's work together on how we can fix this. Because you're right, it is, I don't want to see this pushed to the side again. I mean, this report came out in 2000, and I think they did this in 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's 2021, 6 years later. Between then and now, like, if you're not Indigenous, you probably wouldn't have thought about it at all. But Indigenous people have always known these things that they had recommended, and none of them were getting done. And so it's
Well, the Prime Minister mentioned after Kamloops, as you recall, he developed and actually announced a strategy, most of which actually were simply some of the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. So I don't want to say better late than never, because that's rather trite given the circumstances here. But what you're looking for here, I assume what you're saying here, Verna, is action, not words.
Yes. Well, both. I think some people want to hear the words, right? Because, we need to hear those words and hold him to it. Like many, I've seen over the past 2 days how many times he's been quoted on how his relationship with Indigenous people is one of his most, important relationships. We remember those words that he said, and he's not been doing enough to prove those words.
Well, we'll follow the words and the actions, I guess, going forward. Verna, thank you so much for spending some time with it today. I know it's a very emotional time for you. We really do appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
The Bill Kelly Show, weekdays from 9 to noon on 900 CHML.
The Bill Kelly Podcast is available on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts from. You can also listen to The Bill Kelly Show weekdays from 9 till noon on 900 CHML. I'm Bill Kelly. Thanks again for listening. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. It's free, so you never miss an episode. And make sure that you rate and review.
I'm Sarah Ritchie. I'm a reporter for Global News in Halifax. I was working the day everything changed in Nova Scotia last April. My team has spent the last year asking tough questions about how a gunman disguised as a police officer murdered 22 people over 13 hours. On our podcast, 13 Hours Inside the Nova Scotia Massacre, we examine this tragedy hour by hour. We're learning there's a lot more to this story. Listen to all 13 episodes now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts.